Tonight, the Palestinian question. For 43 years, these people have been denied a homeland. As the Gulf War draws its battle lines, does it offer any hope for the Palestinians? Is there a solution? That's our story tonight.
Live from Canberra, the ABC's Late Line. Here's Kerry O'Brien.
Welcome to the program. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, it had nothing to do with Palestine and the Palestinian search for a homeland. That was a link the Iraqi president tagged on at a later date. But the Palestinians are fundamental to any hope for a lasting peace in the Middle East. Without finding a way to give the Palestinians a homeland, the Middle East will remain in a state of permanent instability. So, is there a hope of a Palestinian solution emerging from this conflict, or has that prospect diminished even further? In a moment, we'll talk by satellite to a leading voice from the Jewish world and one from the Palestinian. But we start with reporter Prue Lawan's look at the last time there were attempts to bring Israel and the Palestinians together.
Israel isn't fighting Saddam Hussein, for as the missile attacks go unanswered, Israel is fighting the future. 1991 is Saddam Hussein's war, but it's the Arab-Israeli conflict which runs unbroken through the modern Middle East. And when the international community sits down to redraw the region, Israel can expect the Palestinian question high on the agenda. The policy of braving Iraqi scuds is already paying dividends.
And I want to state here publicly how much I appreciated Israel's restraint from the outset, really from the very beginning of this crisis. Prime Minister Shamir and his government have shown great understanding for the interests of the United States.
With the outbreak of the popular uprising, the Intifada, in 1987, the Israelis began to lose the public relations battle to the Palestinians. Tear gas, deportations, detention without trial and condemnation by the United Nations was the world's view of Israel's occupied territories. And when Yasser Arafat before the UN in 1988 acknowledged Israel's right to exist and renounced terrorism, the Palestinian Liberation Organization had become the acceptable face of Palestinian nationalism.
I repeat for the record that we totally and absolutely renounce all forms of terrorism. All forms of terrorism.
And despite Israeli protest, the US government responded immediately.
The United States is prepared for a substantive dialogue with PLO representatives.
The PLO's acceptance of Israel's right to exist effectively limited the debate to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, a sea change from the movement's charter demanding the total liberation of Palestine. Under mounting pressure from the Intifada, with 1.7 million Palestinians wanting a political solution, Prime Minister Shamir presented a peace plan to Washington, but ruled out the PLO's most basic demand.
We cannot lend ourselves to any steps that will result in a Palestinian state, which is a prescription not for peace but for war.
What Shamir did offer was an election by which the Palestinians would choose representatives to negotiate with Israel. There would be an interim period of self-government and, after 3 years, negotiation for a final settlement which wasn't specified. The Palestinians responded with outrage at the offer of so little. Even Shamir's coalition of the conservative Likud party and more dovish Labour was split. Ariel Sharon, Shamir's right-wing rival, resigned amid accusations that Shamir had Israel on the slippery slope of talks with the PLO and territorial compromise.
The single most important thing was that the political will within the government of Israel simply wasn't there to define this plan in such a way that it was a starting point for negotiations with the Palestinians.
Shamir's plan left most issues unaddressed. Jerusalem is the declared capital of the independent Palestinian state the PLO proclaimed 3 years ago. And while the state is not a political reality, Jerusalem's religious importance to the Palestinians is. From this spot, the Prophet Muhammad is said to have ascended into heaven. But for the Jews, it's no less powerful. Shamir's party is committed to not giving up an inch of land. It considers the West Bank and Gaza all part of Greater Israel and has undertaken to settle Jews there. The arrival of hundreds of thousands of Soviet Jews now provides Israel with the demographic possibility of overcoming the Palestinians. 1989 was the best chance of direct Israeli-Palestinian talks, but because of the factionalism in Israeli politics, it never got to first base. Labour threatened to pull out of the coalition if its hawkish partner refused to proceed. Instead, Likud moved further from compromise, forming a new, more right-wing government with the religious parties. After a year of intense talks, US Secretary of State James Baker summed up the new mood this way.
And if we can't get it quickly, I have to tell you, Mr. Levine, that everybody over there should know that the telephone number is 1-202-456-1414. When you're serious about peace, call us.
Instead, just 2 months later, Iraq invaded Kuwait and Yasser Arafat made his most critical error, siding with the West's new enemy. Last week, Prime Minister Shamir appointed Rahab van Zeevi to his cabinet amid protest from 5 of his senior ministers. Zeevi advocates transferring Palestinians out of the occupied territories altogether.
We'll get rid of the Arab population of the territories. Instead of them, we will have Jews that will come from the Soviet Union. They and we and our children will do the job.
So as Israel moves further to the right and the Palestinians cheer on Saddam Hussein, the issue is how committed is the international community to solving the Palestinian problem.
So what are the prospects for regional stability in the Middle East in the aftermath of war? Joining me from the United States are 3 guests. In Chicago is one of Palestine's most prominent voices. Ibrahim Abu-Lagod is Professor of Political Science at Northwestern University. More importantly, he's a member of the Palestinian National Council, which is the equivalent of a Palestinian parliament in exile. And the American administration has on occasions turned to Professor Abu-Lagod for advice on its attempts to get a Middle East peace settlement. In Washington, we have Douglas Feith, who is an influential supporter of Israel in America. He was a Middle East specialist working for the National Security Council during the Reagan presidency and was also a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense until September 1986. Today, he's a Washington attorney. In New York, we're joined by Dr. Richard Norton, Senior Research Fellow at the International Peace Academy, which has close ties to the United Nations. He has been closely involved in yet another attempt to find a peace package for the Middle East. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Richard Norton, firstly to you, of course the deadlock that has prevailed on the Palestinian issue has not been broken by anyone thus far. How do you break it after the Gulf War?
Well, Kerry, I think we all recognize that wars are destructive by definition, but wars can also create fertile moments for forward movement. And I think that it's very possible that following the conclusion of the Gulf War, we're going to see a very creative moment. There's a growing consensus in Europe, in the Middle East, in the United States as well, that the way to go may well be in a multilateral conference, one which addresses a broad range of issues in the Middle East, including the question of the Palestinians, but not limited to the question of the Palestinians, ranging from a focus on questions of development, borders, security, and human rights and dignity. The point of the matter is that there's a need to create a creatively ambiguous structure, one in which every state of the region will have a seat, one in which every state in the region will have a stake, a negotiation which will have parallel tracks, where one track doesn't necessarily depend on the success of another.
So
does
does the PLO have a place at that table?
The question of Palestinian representation is one of the most difficult ones, and frankly, we don't have an answer to that at this stage. At the IPA, at the International Peace Academy, we're seriously exploring this multilateral negotiation format, but I must say, you've asked me to crack the hardest nut, which is to say the question of Palestinian representation.
But surely
it's obvious that
surely until you crack that nut, you're not going to get to first base.
That doesn't necessarily follow. I think that if we can reach agreement on an agenda which includes the question of Palestine, which includes the question of Palestinian rights, Palestinian national rights, I must say, then I think we can enjoy the potential of some forward movement. The question of Palestinian representation has to be addressed. But I'm afraid that if we begin with that, we may well deadlock what could be a constructive and positive series of negotiations.
Well, presuming that you actually get this conference off the deck, what kind of issue do you start with that gives you some chance of success to keep the thing going?
Well, this may be one of those moments when focusing on key security issues which affect all the states of the region is precisely the way to begin. Prime Minister Shamir of Israel has proposed several times the creation of a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East. This proposal involves a subject, which is to say weapons of mass destruction that affect all the states of the region. So that starting with this may well be the way to go. The point, Kerry, is to create momentum. The point is to create successes. And in the process, these successes will overflow to the more problematic areas. The point is to start with issues that can be resolved relatively easily and move to the more difficult issues.
Okay.
But not to begin with the issues which will stalemate us.
Okay. Ibrahim Abu-Lughod, would the Palestinians be bloody-minded about a conference that doesn't include them? Even if that does offer up the possibility down the track of a resolution to your satisfaction?
I think it's quite clear on the basis of 43 years of experience that without addressing the issue of Palestine, that is Palestinian national rights, meaning their right to independence and sovereignty on their own national homeland, their right to be represented by their own designated representative, has been at the crux of the conflict between the Palestinians and Israel. For 43 years, the solution to that question has not only eluded us, but also has contributed tremendously to the destabilization of the Middle East and has contributed to the eruption of conflict between Israel and the Arab states. Therefore, I think we recognize today that in the aftermath of this war, just as before this war erupted, in fact, there has been an important several important issues that must be addressed seriously by the countries of the region themselves, as well as by the United States and the United Nations. Second, there has been an international consensus on the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, meaning their independence. The Palestinians have, in fact, declared their state, whereas the reality is that the Palestinians today are occupied in the West Bank and Gaza, and since the eruption of this war, in fact, the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza have been under a constant curfew. Now, the immediate issue, therefore, once this war is terminated, and hopefully it will be terminated soon with survivors from this war with dignity and so forth, that the United States, in fact, will address the issues that have eluded us thus far. And foremost is question of Palestine.
Yes, now, but very briefly, what I'm asking you is this.
I'm telling you.
Could you see the Palestinians?
The Palestine Liberation Organization is designated by the Palestinian people as their sole representative. You either address yourself to the question of Palestinian rights, which means that the right to choose their own representative, which must negotiate on their behalf, which has negotiated with everybody else, and therefore it must be part of the peacemaking process. Now, whether it is a multilateral conference or a conference between the Palestinians and Israel under United Nations auspices, the mechanism is irrelevant. But there can be no solution to Palestinian independence and sovereignty in the West Bank and Gaza without negotiation by the Palestine Liberation Organization.
Okay.
And I think the sooner we face that issue, the sooner we will resolve the conflict that has gone on for so long.
Douglas Feith, what's your immediate response to Richard Norton's proposal?
The most hopeful development for Arab-Israeli peace that emerges out of the Gulf crisis, I believe, is the damage that's been done to the standing of the PLO. The PLO has been one of the main enemies of peace. It's allied itself with Saddam Hussein in this war, and in doing so, it has horrified the Israeli peace movement. It's undermined its standing throughout the Western world, especially among people who thought that the PLO had transformed itself from what is a fundamentally terrorist organization into a fundamentally statesman-like organization. And I think that what's likely to emerge is an understanding, perhaps most importantly within the Arab world, among, for example, the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, the other Gulf countries, the Egyptians, that if there is going to be progress in Arab-Israeli peace, the Palestinians are going to have to find a better leadership than the PLO. The Iraqi people right now are paying a terrible price for having a very bad leadership. The Palestinian Arab people have paid a very terrible price for having a very bad leadership for a long time. And if this war helps inspire a change in that leadership, there could be a real prospect for Arab-Israeli peace.
In the short term, though, you would expect Shamir to continue to reject any kind of direct negotiation with the PLO?
I don't believe there's any prospect of Shamir or any government in Israel negotiating in the foreseeable future with the PLO.
The historic position of the Zionist movement, including the governments of Israel, is to reject the negotiation with any legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, a rejection that is born out of their rejection of the Palestinian national right to self-determination.
But hang on, let me just put this point to you.
Let me finish the statement.
If you could make it very brief, please.
Very brief. The Palestine Liberation Organization has supported and continues to support a peaceful resolution of the conflict between Iraq and Kuwait on the basis of the right of the Kuwaiti people and the Iraqi people to self-determination, on the basis of the United Nations Charter and the Charter of the League of the Arab States, within a peace conference that will uphold these principles. And therefore, the position of the Palestine Liberation Organization has been consistently for a peaceful resolution for this conflict and against a war solution as inspired by the United States.
But the basic fact is that about 8 months ago, the Palestinians and the PLO seem to have actually won significant sympathy from the United States, and that is gone now as a result of Yasser Arafat's alignment with Saddam Hussein, which it would seem has been a massive propaganda disaster for the Palestinians. How do you recover from that? Credibly.
In fact, that has not been true. Public opinion in the United States continues to endorse the right of the Palestinian to independence and sovereignty in the West Bank and Gaza. In fact, the Palestinian people as a whole continue to espouse the right of both people, the Iraqi people and the Kuwaiti people, and the Palestinians continue to call for a peaceful resolution of the conflict between the Palestinians and Israel in the context of an international conference or a conference that will bring the two parties together face to face. In fact, I think there is much greater support for the Palestinians today worldwide. As we notice, the Saudis have not gone back on their support for Palestinian self-determination. The Kuwaitis have not. The Syrians have not. The Egyptians have not. Okay. In fact, the entire world in the United Nations continue to endorse the Palestinian right to self-determination.
Well, I think that will be better tested.
Participate in the peace conference.
That will be better tested in the months to come. Douglas Feith,
of course.
It would seem that this government in Israel is as hardline a government, if not the most hardline government that we've seen. Can we really expect any kind of yielding from Shamir post-war at all?
I think that the Israeli government has expressed interest in peace negotiations with the Arab states. I think that there may be opportunities, as I said, arising out of this war. When you have an alignment with the United States and Saudi Arabia, the Syrians are participating. There is a great turmoil in the political picture in the Middle East. Possibly out of that turmoil can come a recognition on the part of the conservative Arab states that many of Israel's most violent and fervid enemies are also the most violent and fervid enemies and the most immediate threat to regimes like that in Saudi Arabia.
Aren't you basically saying that Shamir's game plan after this war will be to pursue bilateral arrangements with individual countries, basically dividing and ruling the Arab world?
Well, there's no prospect of Israel dividing and ruling.
But you know the strategy I'm talking about.
Over 100 million people.
No, but
I think that the Israelis would be interested in concluding peace agreements with their neighbors in Syria or Jordan, the way they concluded a peace agreement with their neighbors in Egypt.
But surely they can't be concluded without a resolution of the Palestinian conflict as well.
There are the basic problem, I believe, in the Arab-Israeli context is whether there are Arab interlocutors for Israel who both desire peace and have the authority to make peace. There are only possibilities of finding such interlocutors. It's not for sure. I think that if we're going to be realistic, we have to keep our expectations quite low. But at the same time, you have to exploit whatever opportunities arise, because peace would be very desirable if it can be achieved.
But you're talking about, it sounds to me that you're quite pessimistic about real stability in this region for a long time to come. Am I right?
I think you are right. There is a problem with the general level of violence and in the region, the way politics is played in the region, the passionate and extremist nature of much of the politics in the region, the non-democratic nature of many of the regimes, virtually all the regimes in the region other than Israel. And you just don't have, throughout the Middle East, the kind of political circumstances, the kind of moderation, the kind of willingness to compromise, the kind of commitment to restraint, limited government, and moderate ambitions with respect to Israel that would give one a lot of hope that there can be a peaceful resolution achieved in the near future.
I think it's important to point out that Israel must withdraw from Syrian territory that it has been occupying for over 20 years, and it must also withdraw from southern Lebanon. And on the basis of therefore the acceptance of Resolution 242 that was passed by the United Nations Security Council, then clearly it will find the parties that will make peace with it, because the prerequisite for peace is clearly the cessation of Israel's domination and control of its neighbors, including the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and Jerusalem. So there are parties to that peace, and they are available. They are all bound by the United Nations Security Council Resolution 242, and they are prepared to attend an international peace conference. I think the challenge of the moment is for the United States to take the initiative and convene that international conference.
Okay, now we're just about out of time, but Richard Norton, you're the peacemaker in the middle. What do you make of the discussion we've just heard? To me, it sounds quite pessimistic.
Well, Kerry, I think we've just heard a sample of just how difficult the negotiations are likely to be. And I think we've also heard a compelling case for not starting with the hardest issue. There's no question that the question of Palestine must be on the negotiating agenda, that the fate of the Palestinians and their quest for a nation-state must be addressed. But what I've just heard over the past few minutes leaves me even more convinced that the point is to start in easier areas, to start in areas where we're more likely to find success. Moreover, I think it's completely unrealistic to expect that Israel will unilaterally withdraw from territories it occupies. There must be a process of negotiations, and indeed the Arab states must collaborate, if you will, to bring Israel into those negotiations. We're not going to have the sort of concessions that Professor Abu-Lughod is demanding.
Oh, I said there must be a negotiated process which will see the withdrawal of Israel from the occupied territories.
And we are about to lose the satellite, so we are going to have to leave it there. Richard Norton in New York, Doug Feith in Washington, and Ibrahim Abu-Lughod in Chicago. Thank you all very much for participating. And now let's catch up.
A rare and remarkable interview with Yasser Arafat. Arafat has been widely seen as the big loser in the Gulf crisis. By publicly embracing Saddam Hussein shortly after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, the the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization has clearly eroded support for the PLO cause, even within the Arab world. Coalition leaders, including our own Foreign Minister Gareth Evans, have openly speculated that the Palestinians may now have to find more moderate leadership to represent them at any Middle East peace conference. Against that background, the embattled PLO chairman sent out word at the weekend that he was finally prepared to talk. The journalist he agreed to speak to was veteran Middle East correspondent Peter George. George was summoned to a heavily guarded location in Tunis at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Thank you, Mr.
No sooner had he sat down with Arafat than a minder handed the PLO leader a message that the Allies had just launched their ground offensive.
What does it tell you?
Started just now.
That was the extraordinary setting for Peter George's exclusive interview with Yasser Arafat.
Why did you align yourself with Saddam Hussein?
You have to understand that Saddam Hussein had supported the Palestinians when he had mentioned for the first time to make this linkage between the oil, which was the main reason for the American and European military presence in this area.
Did President Saddam tell you before the invasion of Kuwait that he would link it with the Palestinian issue?
No.
Was there any promise of this?
No. Please.
Then why do you think that he...
Please.
Why do you think that he has used this linkage?
Please. Not try to provocate me. Please. And I hope that you have to carry on with your question.
But why do you think...
Simple and clear, and I have to... you have the right, but you have to give me the right to answer. Please. This linkage was a request from our people under occupation. This is very important, under occupation. To President Saddam Hussein, after the Gulf crisis started, to make this linkage. And he had accepted it. And on the 12th of August, he declared his initiative, accepting the request of the Palestinians under occupation, in which he had declared the linkage between the two causes.
Do you not then feel disappointed that one of the first things he dropped in trying to bring about a ceasefire was the linkage of the Palestinians to this battle?
You know, what is going now is not the political issues. Now, the first start is ceasing fire and to achieve peace. And you know, after that, there will be the whole talks about the whole points, including Palestine, including South Lebanon, including the prices of the oil, including the security of the region. So this is the start. The start is ceasing fire to stop this blood war and to achieve real peace for all of us, not for one side and slavery to the other side.
If anyone is going to win in this war, it seems no winner.
Yes.
Including the Palestinians.
Including the Americans.
But including the Palestinians.
Including the Americans. For a very simple reason. You have to remember that that Britain and France had defeated Nasser.
But they lost in the end, I know. But what I want to know, Mr.
Politically,
Chairman,
they lost.
Well, what I want to know, Mr. Chairman, is what do you think is going to happen to the Palestinians as a result of this conflict?
You know, this area, without achieving a real solution, with one standard for the international unity, the volcano will continue in this area.
Well, in that case, the Palestinians lose whichever way you look at it.
The Palestinians lose, the Israelis will lose, the Americans will lose, the Arab nation will lose, the people in this Middle East will lose, the nations in this. We have nothing to lose. This is the point.
You can lose the friendship of the Saudis and the friendship of many Arab countries who've turned completely against you.
You see, that is, you think that. You have to understand that the crux of the whole issue, the main cause in this area is the Palestinian cause. No stability, no security, no peace, no settlement by overjumping the Palestinian rights.
I mean, the Saudi ambassador to the United Nations describes you as a clown now. I mean, these are words that are never used between...
You see, please, I am not in a situation to reply the ambassador.
Why can you not reply when they...
I am not in a situation to reply the ambassador. I have to wait what His Majesty the King will say.
What about the Israelis in this case? Surely, if
they will lose,
in this case, it must
they will lose because this war gave the proof that security is not a military, not a military issue, not a power issue. This is the peace is a political agreement and not power. Not arrogance of power, but not missiles, not air forces, not tanks. Peace is a peaceful agreement.
What about the Israelis in this case? Surely if anyone wins in this war, it must be the Israelis.
They will not solve anything. More confusion and more damage. You have to understand that this war will leave deep traces and scars among the nations.
Is it fair to say that what we're looking at now is a more radical face of the PLO?
Why?
Because
I am speaking frankly to you, to let you understand. I said it in the beginning of the crisis, you remember. From the beginning, I said that this is not a war. There will be a catastrophe. And imagine what will happen, and especially the American troops, the British troops, began to use napalm, which is a forbidden weapons, unconventional weapons. What will be the retaliation from the other side? We want to stop this mad war. This was my appeal from the beginning. Enough is enough.
Is it fair to say that you have given up on the West and you're now looking at other ways of achieving your aims?
No,
we're looking at
for the Europeans, no. But for the Americans, I have enough lessons.
You have given up with them?
You see, I can't forget that they had deceived me personally many times.
So do you withdraw?
I can't say that I am from give up. I can't give up from anything. I am a freedom fighter.
Do you withdraw the statements that you made in Geneva in 1988, recognizing Israel's right to exist and also renouncing terrorism?
I am completely committed to it, because it is only the PNC who can change this political program.
So when Abu Abbas in January called for a war against the West and for Palestinians to strike in the West, that's wrong. You would denounce that?
Not to forget that I am the chairman of PLO and the president of State of Palestine.
But do you
have
what Abu Abbas
you
called
see,
for?
It is clear and obvious. You
No,
have
it's not
to go
clear to me,
to
Mr.
ask.
Chairman.
No, you have to ask the others who had declared, and not me. What I am committed to is the PNC resolutions.
But you must understand...
And the international legality.
But you must understand that in the West there is a great fear now. You've heard of it, you've seen it.
And you are not putting our fears in your consideration. While now there is a member in the Israeli cabinet his political program is transfer for the Palestinians from the occupied territories.
Where do you go from here?
To my country.
You said to me once you were a stone's throw away from achieving a Palestinian state. Are you any closer now, or are you perhaps you're a Scud missile distance away now?
Closer now. For a very simple reason. Because no stability, no security, no peace, no settlement by overjumping the Palestinian rights. And even those on the other side with the American alliance from the Arabs, they are in need to fulfill their promises to their masses that they will continue making the linkage, but after the solution of the Gaza crisis.
So the West is wrong when they say Arafat has made his biggest mistake and he's finished.
You see, you had repeated the same during Camp David. And you had repeated the same when during the siege of Beirut. You have repeated the same during the siege of Tripoli. You see, you see, this is the will and the determination of the Palestinian people, and this is my guidance. I am following it, and it is only for the Palestinian people who decide who will represent them.
An unrepentant Yasser Arafat. Peter George obtained that exclusive interview.
In our ABC special next...
Jerusalem. This is the holy city for both Jews and Arabs. They both claim it as their own. The inspiration for their religions is here. This is where the sacred places are. Just down there, the Wailing Wall, the most sacred place in all of Judaism. Above it, overlooking the wall, the Dome of the Rock, one of the holiest places in the Arab world outside Mecca. Jerusalem brings Jews and Arabs together, but the dome and the wall have become powerful symbols of a bitter conflict that's divided them for well over a century. But the tensions here in Jerusalem are only part of a much wider problem. Since the creation of Israel, there have been 5 wars and at least 75 diplomatic initiatives to try and find a solution. Every one has failed. Well, now there's another one underway. In the wake of the Gulf War, we're told that there's a window of opportunity here now that's never existed before. Well, I've come to Israel to find out what people themselves are saying and thinking at this critical moment in their history. And their lives have been dogged by this conflict for generations now. Are they finally ready to make their peace? Well, in this program tonight and next week, Israelis and Palestinians will tell us how they see their lives in the aftermath of the Gulf War and the prospects for peace. All of this was known as Palestine once. It was carved out of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. Until 1947, it was administered by the British under a mandate from the United Nations. Then, British Palestine was split. The United Nations drew a line roughly down the centre there to create the State of Israel on that side, the State of Palestine over there. In the middle, Jerusalem was to be an international enclave. But the Arab countries, and the Palestinians in particular, have never accepted that, and that's where the seeds of this present conflict have been sown. Whose land is this? Well, for the moment, it's all Israel. In the 1967 war, the Israeli army advanced beyond the established borders and occupied all that country right through there to the Jordan River on the far horizon, the West Bank. This is occupied territory I'm standing on now. Down there in the towns and villages of the West Bank, There are well over 1 million Palestinians living under Israeli occupation. They have virtually no rights and certainly no say in the running of the country. There are hundreds of thousands more living in the most appalling conditions in refugee camps across the river in Jordan, and they have been there for 20 years now. This disputed territory is central to the problems of the Middle East. But Israel has consistently refused to move an inch, and that's still the official position. But what do Israelis themselves say about this? I mean, after the experience of the Gulf War, are they any more prepared to do a deal for peace? Well, Barbara Oberman, I'm just interested, has the experience of the war caused you to rethink your position in any way?
Can I tell you my experience of the war? I'm a grandmother of very small children, and I had 4 of them in my sealed room. And while I was worried about my smallest one turning blue in a little tiny tent-like thing, which was ghastly, and the other one having hysterics with his gas mask on, we heard over the radio that the Palestinians were cheering on the Scuds. And you ask me how I feel about the situation. I don't think the situation as it stands is a good one at all. And frankly, I would offer peace for peace, as our Golda used to say, peace for peace.
So your position's hardened then, if anything?
My position is hardened.
Annette Hoffman, you do a lot of work with Palestinians, don't you? I mean, you've heard what Barbara Oberman has to say. I mean,
Yes.
Do you think positions have hardened in Israel as a result of what you went through?
I think some of the left has healed from a romanticizing attitude of the Palestinian. They see now that the Palestinian is the enemy. All the more it means that we have to sit and talk to the enemy. Maybe we would like a different enemy. Some people would like to have Norway as their enemy. They're more civilized people. Maybe you, the Australians, you talk nicer. You would be a better enemy. But what can we do? This is the enemy. This is where he lives. We must talk. And as a mother, I will say to this grandmother, no one died of talking. No one I know died of talking. Let's talk now.
But how did you feel? I mean, you clearly have a lot of sympathy for the Palestinians, but how did you feel when the Palestinians were dancing in the streets as the Scuds came into Israel?
I'd like to correct that. I don't have sympathy with the Palestinians. I have sympathy with my own Jewish values, humanitarian values. I hate to see myself as an occupier. And when I saw them dancing on the roof, and I haven't seen it, but I heard that they have, I can see how years of bitter humiliation and having no rights will cause you to, it's a human reaction, to rejoice when you see, to rejoice when you see your enemy, to rejoice when you see your enemy fall from the hands of another Arab.
Just over here.
I did see the Palestinians dancing on the roofs just across the street from my house, while my children and 5,000 other little children of Ariel were going into sealed rooms. I saw and heard Palestinians standing on their roofs and cheering. And yet, I'm prepared to find a way to live with them. I'm prepared to find a way to coexist and to live together in a homeland and in a territory that has tremendous strategic importance for Israel.
And historically important. I think the experience of the Gulf War, if anything, taught us, number one, that if oil is involved, the world can unite. The world has never united for humanitarian purposes. It didn't unite in World War II when 6 million Jews were brought to the gas chambers. It hasn't united since when people were killed in Africa or people were transported from Bulgaria to Turkey when there were massive population transfers. Now, wait a second. The fact of the matter is that the Kurds were encouraged to revolt against the Iraqis, and it took the death of thousands of Kurds to bring some kind of aid. The world doesn't unite over humanitarian purposes.
Here we sat being rained upon with these devastating Scuds. And you also, what have we done to Iraq? Are we threatening Iraq that we deserve this kind of treatment? So who's threatening whom here? So the point must be asked, if that is the case, then one comes to the conclusion that pan-Arabism as such has never really accepted the reality or the existence of a Jewish state in its presence. It's not a question of 23 countries wanting to add a 24th Arab nation here. That's not the issue. The key issue, whether Jews should have a state of their own in this part of the world.
Look, you're not telling me. Is there anyone here who can tell me whether their own personal position was changed as a result of the experience of the Gulf War? Have any of you changed your positions at all? You say yes.
Definitely. During the war, was doing my army service. I saw people dancing on the roofs opposite me, and it changed my opinion from a person who wasn't willing to give back territory to actually the opposite, because there was a realization to me that we will not be able to coexist. As much as everyone would like to say, I'd like to make peace with these people, I'd like to live with them, we can't live with them. When someone is dancing opposite you when a Scud is coming over, it's clear to you that that person is not even willing to make a compromise to live with you. Therefore, we can't live together.
Just over here, just one at a time, just a moment. Here.
I would suggest, if this gentleman feels that we can't coexist with these people, I think we can coexist with these people in the state of Israel. If they don't want to coexist with us, then I would suggest that they take a bus, and in half an hour, they'll be across the border into Jordan, where 70% of the population is Palestinian. They can make not one Palestinian state there, they can make half a dozen states there.
Okay, look, just before we leave this question of public opinion, it seems to me, and correct me if I've got the wrong impression from what you've told me here, has public opinion been hardened in Israel as a result of the experience that you went through? Susan Hattis-Roth, do you think it has?
I'm not completely sure. I think many of us have been doing some thinking, but I think some of the people here have